Hey Laura,
Hey, Brooke.
how are you doing today?
I'm good. I am actually celebrating a day off today.
Yeah,
It's a Friday, so 3-day weekend feels really good.
nice. And you were
So yeah,
saying you slept in.
I got to sleep in, which is one of my favorite hobbies.
What
So,
does that mean for you? Because like what's your normal wake up time?
okay, so I can sleep until like 11 a.m.
Nice.
I mean, like I can really sleep in. So, but typically, like on a work day, I used to get up at 5 a.m. and go to boot camp and like
Okay.
work out and do burpees and stuff.
Yeah.
And then I realized that's crazy. And so I stopped doing that because I was having to nap during the day.
Yeah.
And so now I'm like, I try to be into work by 8:30 in the morning. And so I'm
Okay.
usually getting out of bed at about 8:20.
Nice. That's awesome.
So sleeping in is really me getting out of bed anytime after 8:30.
Okay.
So
Okay.
so yeah.
So like I'm totally jealous of that because I have this thing like I think I do my best thinking in the morning first of all
Mhm.
because
Yeah.
there's no distractions and I can
Yes.
just think. So like I do like that part, but there is just something in my body that like come like 4:30 it's like time to be up, like let's
Yep,
go. And
yep,
so
yep.
I'm just up, but sleeping in for me is like maybe 6 or 6:30. Like I just don't, it's not very late at all. So
Yeah.
I'm totally jealous.
Yeah, no, I
Oh.
sleeping is I'm like a GDE in sleeping. So,
Nice,
yeah.
nice. Google developer expert in
And
sleeping in
sleeping
REM sleep.
in, I
Nice.
can take naps whenever I want. Yeah, it's like
Oh, okay,
it's
that would
definitely
be
yeah, it's a nice hobby. So,
cool. Okay, now I have to ask though, because I remember I don't I can't remember if it was the first online ng-conf or the second. You submitted like a video, right?
yes,
About
about my special talent, my superpower.
yes. So tell us more about that.
Well, my superpower is that I find four-leaf clovers like all the time, really just everywhere. I'll be walking along, minding my own business, and I just look down and I'm like, "Well, there's one."
That's so cool.
Yeah, it's a very weird. I think it just comes from like I notice differences, like it's the
Mm,
that noticing of differences. And so like a three-leaf clover has a totally different shape than a four-leaf clover.
okay.
And so it's like just being able to notice the shape difference and looking for patterns. So yeah, I just think I'm really like keyed into that. Uh, so I would say I would go so far as to say if this were like an interview question, like a job interview, I'd be like, it's one of the things that makes me a good developer because I
For
can
sure.
see differences in the
Yeah.
code. I'll be like, that pattern's off. And so yeah, it's just one of those things that I feel like I do well as I recognize patterns, and that applies well to visual patterns, such as looking at a whole field of three-leaf clovers and seeing the ones
The
that don't
one.
fit the pattern.
Wow,
So
that's a pretty
yeah,
cool analogy. I like that. And that is like seriously how smart to think of how can I apply that to an interview. So I like that. But
yeah. Did I
I'm
get the
gonna ask
job?
you more. What?
Did I get the job?
You did. You passed. Yes, you're
Excellent,
hired.
excellent. Okay, cool.
But I do want to ask you more about your art here in just a minute. So, because
Sure, sure.
I think that's totally relevant to our discussion. But really, like, first of all, thank you for being here because this I feel like is a really important topic. We have this, I don't know like what it is. Well, I guess I kind of do, but there is this stigma with Angular. I think that when people hear about it, you know, they're like, "Oh, why would you learn that?" Because
Right.
there's like a learning curve that comes with it, and
Yes.
it's true.
Yes.
But I want to break that down, and I want people to see that this is doable, and you can
Oh,
learn
yeah.
this.
Yeah, I
And
think what I like about Angular is it's a pattern,
right,
like to get back to patterns, like there's like um you can open any Angular application, even the most like horrifyingly complicated Angular application, and there's typically the same patterns exist, right?
right,
Like this is where this kind of code goes, this is where that kind of code goes. Whereas I've opened React apps and I'm like, oh, buddy, I have no idea where any of this stuff is
yeah,
because there isn't sort of like Angular's opinionated enough that like you can only go so far off the rails.
right.
So for like large enterprise organizations or even just applications that are going to get a little unwieldy, I feel like it's a lot easier to sort of maintain at least a very basic structure so
Right.
that when you eventually get it so complicated that everyone's pulling their hair out and you pull in some people to be like, can you help us? They can at least see what's going on from a very high level. And then also I have found too that people do follow some of the same patterns, even if it's an anti-pattern. So I recently spoke in Germany at ng-conf, which is an amazing conference. If I realize it's not ng-conf, but it had that same like amazing vibe, right? Like great community. It was so wonderful to hang out with people.
Cool.
But I did a talk that I called state micromanagement, and it's basically it's the pattern that we sort of end up slipping into when we allow our components to just keep growing and growing and growing.
Yeah.
So those 3,000 line components, it's just that is a huge, like that's a major symptom of a state micromanagement anti-pattern, where you're trying so hard to manually manage every little thing that happens in your application that you're overcomplicating the component for yourself. And for anyone else who has the displeasure of ever opening up and trying to fix a bug or add a feature.
Privilege.
Yeah. So but yeah, I do feel like with Angular, there are certain patterns, like really, it's hard to go too far off the rails into some like totally wacky pattern. Whereas, like I said, with a React app, I definitely had one I worked on where it was like, I can't explain what they did to navigation, but like, it was impossible to just like navigate to somewhere and then go back to the page you were on before, because the way they had written the navigation, it would pop you all the way back to the root of the application.
Okay. Yeah.
And it took months and many very, very talented developers to figure out what the heck was going on.
Right.
Because it had just like gotten so far off the rails.
Yeah.
So yeah. And granted, Angular apps can get off the rails, but it's like, it's a little easier to pump the brakes on it, I think.
Right. And I agree. Like it does, like it comes with that, the best word really is framework that guides you, those guardrails that keep you in that pattern. So yeah, I really like what you're saying there.
Yeah. And honestly, coming out of something like C#, it's, .NET development, like following like an MVC pattern, like it made sense to be like, oh, okay, here's where my logic is. Here's the view. I'm going to do like layers of separation between, my services, like my data layer, my business layer, and like it follows a lot of those same patterns. So I feel like people trying to bridge the gap between coming from a very backend heavy code like .NET or even Java, moving into Angular is not as shocking as other JavaScript frameworks can be.
Okay. Okay, so that's interesting. So, and that's actually one thing I wanted to go over with you, because one thing I'd like to do with the series is really talk to people, who aren't just coming from like a computer science background, who are coming from different professions. Exactly, myself.
It's me.
Right?
That's me.
But different pathways. And so I know, like with you, like let's step back here, because your journey really is fun, I think. And this is where I want to bring in some of that art background. But you actually majored in, art, painting, and then botany.
Yes.
So I love that. That kind of brings in the 4-leaf clovers.
Yes.
And then from there you went on and you had like a freelance, almost like a craft shop.
It was an Etsy shop. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Awesome.
Yep. I jumped on that Etsy train very early and I didn't make software engineering money at it, but I made enough money that it was my job, it was a salary, like it wasn't a salary. I had to do all the work, but it was enough money that it felt like to our family that I had a job.
Right. Okay. So it gave you what you needed.
It did. And I could be home with the kids.
Which is awesome.
Yeah, because I have two kids. They're not little anymore. One of them literally voted in the last election. So that was like, oh my gosh, you're an adult. Except you still don't do the laundry.
Yeah, exactly. And your curfew is at 9 p.m.
Right. You're still going to be home at time. But yeah. So it allowed that. But yeah.
Okay. Well, so then what prompted you to get it? Because then your next job was, like you were saying, and this is why I'm going back full circle, is you got into programming, but you were doing C# and .NET. So
yeah, and I was actually doing Visual Basic and .NET
okay.
Web Forms, which is like a
Oh,
whole other level. It's like another circle of hell, right? Because
yeah.
it was sort of like MVC came after Web Forms. So I didn't get into Visual Basic like back like there's previous iterations of Visual Basic that luckily I did not have to learn. So I was
Right.
learning VB.NET. I was learning web forms, and I had this whole application. So basically what happened is that I ran my sewing business for like 8 years, and
Okay.
it was hours and hours and hours of me sewing in the basement. I would be up until 4 in the morning
Oh,
sewing. Then I'd
okay.
have to get up at like 8 a.m. with my kids. And then, we do a lot of things where I'd be like, let's make a nest on the floor and watch a movie. And then I'd pass out.
Yeah.
And so it it was just a lot, and I felt like every second of my day was me running this business, and I
Hmm.
hated it.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't mind the sewing so much, but it also wasn't very creative. It would be like if somebody's told an Angular developer, "Build this same component every day for the rest of your life." And you're
Over
like, "I
hours.
don't wanna
Yeah.
do this anymore. Like, I can't. Like,
Right.
this my brain is way more creative than this.
Yeah.
I can't keep just milling out the same work over and over again." And if anyone has ever worked in customer service, some people are just truly, deeply horrible humans
Mean.
in the middle of their soul. Like, that is just what drives every
Oh,
interaction they have with everybody.
oh,
And I
that's so
just got
sad.
so fed up with
Yeah.
dealing with these just entitled, horrible people.
Yeah.
Um, and I realized that I didn't want to do that anymore. And
Right.
my husband's best friend, um, Ben Gailey, I've said his name before. He's a wonderful person. He was head of IT at this very small company in St. Louis, and they needed a software engineer. And small companies rarely pay software engineers what software engineers typically get paid.
Right.
And he's like, "Would you be willing to learn on the job?" And I said, "Okay."
Why
So,
not?
yeah, I knew some HTML, I knew some CSS. When
Okay.
I did study art, um, I was sort of aware enough of me not being a trust fund baby that I knew I needed some sort of like backup in the art world. Like, there
Right.
wasn't going to be, my daddy wasn't going to come in and pay my rent,
Right.
or float me an allowance or buy me a little tiny European car or anything, right? Like, I was going to be the one feeding myself and housing myself and clothing myself.
Yeah.
And it is very hard to do that with art, as one might imagine. Um, and so I knew that I needed to learn certain skills just to be able to survive, right? And so I
Okay.
was like, okay, I'll learn Photoshop. I learned Dreamweaver. I learned Flash. So I did some
Nice. Nice.
Flash websites for a while, and
Okay.
but in learning Dreamweaver, you sort of inadvertently also can learn HTML and CSS because
Okay.
inevitably Dreamweaver doesn't do it right. So you have to look at the source code and be like, oh, okay. And then eventually you start realizing that reading the source code is not as hard as you thought it was.
Right.
And so I had already done HTML and CSS. I'd learned a little bit of JavaScript. I did some action scripting with Flash. And so that
Okay.
is like very similar to JavaScript. Um, and so I wasn't coming into it like ice cold, but I had never done anything really on the back end professionally. I'd done some
Right.
like literal basic programming in elementary school and middle school. And then the high school I went to, so I graduated in the 90s. They had a whole room of Apple computers that none
Okay.
of the teachers knew how to teach us on. And so they just kept that room locked up. And the only
Oh,
kids that could go in there and use it had to have special permission. And
wow.
I just didn't care. Like, nobody was in my life being like, you should be a software engineer. They're all just like,
Right.
I don't know. I just kind of like shut out computers from my life. I mean, I learned how to type, and that's about all I needed in high school.
Yep.
And then you get to college, you're like, okay, they're expecting me to send an email. How do I do that? Oh gosh, like that's crazy. And then, it's like just sort of like building your skills back up. And then I was like,
Yeah.
okay, I should learn how to do like digital artwork. And so back then it was Macromedia. So I mastered the Macromedia suite. I had Photoshop, mastered Photoshop, learned Illustrator, learned InDesign, like the whole Adobe suite. I learned how to edit videos. I had Final Cut Pro,
Right.
like all that stuff, all the things that art kids were doing. And so luckily I was able to apply some of what I learned there in this role as a software engineer.
Right.
But it was still a lot of me reading through Stack Overflow. I had that like 3-inch thick book, the ASP.NET 4.0. And that helped. But that's when a lot of the code, like some people write in Visual Basic. Most people write in C# if you're writing .NET. And so I would go to figure out how to do something. I would get the answer in C# and I would have to translate it to Visual Basic. So I sort of inadvertently learned C# at the same time that I learned Visual Basic.
Okay.
And then I was like, okay, this is stupid. We're not writing apps in Visual Basic anymore. Like new apps are going to be C# because we're going to have a really hard time finding new developers that are like, yeah, I totally want to come write Visual Basic with you. That's not really like, and there are just some things that, like Visual Basic is not being actively developed in, so like, especially when you get into like Link and stuff like that, there were just certain functions that just didn't exist. And so you'd find the answer in C#. I'd be super stoked. I'm like, this is what I'm going to do. And then I'd go to translate it to Visual Basic. And it was like that sad trombone sound, like, womp, womp, you're not doing that.
Yeah.
And yeah, like, too bad for you. And so, yeah. And then around that time, I was also going to a lot of conferences.
Okay.
And so there's,
and I was going to ask, so it sounds like you were reading like actual physical books a little bit. You were looking at some documentation.
Yeah.
And then you've got these conferences. Because what I want to do is get an understanding of like, what does learning look like to you? What if you sit down and you're learning, what does that process look like?
Yeah, so it's a lot of like, I imagine like a caveman with a rock and another rock and like trying to smash it, and just like, work, and then eventually I'm like, okay, this isn't working. I need to Google something, and I Google it and I'll be like, that's not quite right. Because, like even in the beginning, I didn't know how to Google things, right? And so I think that's something that's very easy to take for granted now. Like I have an idea of how to Google something, but back then it was like, what is this? And so I Google it, and my strategy was I would Google it. I would get something that seemed close-ish, and then I would look for words in the answers to Google it again to see if I could get a better answer. And so doing that process helped me get better and better answers. I started finding people that wrote blogs that I could follow that were that seemed fairly reliable. There's this one gentleman on YouTube, Venkat. He taught me like everything I knew about .NET, but he had this whole like video series, and it was great. And I would just sit there and watch those and like kind of like scrub like a disc jockey, like I'm scrubbing back and forth on the YouTube, like say that again. I can't understand like what that concept is, And
do you take notes at all? Is that something
I do? I have like books and books. I finally threw away a lot of my like .NET books because I just don't use them anymore. But yeah, I keep notebooks. Like I always have a notebook right next to me, and it's just notes and notes. Because sometimes it's just I'm a 90s kid. It's active writing it down. It kind of just like clicks it in my head.
Yep.
And sometimes I honestly just have to sit on it for a while.
Right.
And be like, okay, I'm going to kind of just stew in this idea, and then I'll like take a nap because that's what I'm good at. And then like I'll wake up and I'll be like, oh, I get it. Oh, I get it. I know how to do this. Like the first time I figured out how to like sort of like climb around on the DOM tree, I was like, I'm a wizard. I know how to do this. I know how to traverse the DOM tree, because that was back in the jQuery days. And that was like pretty much, that was how we wrote JavaScript, right? Was and that was sort of my introduction to JavaScript, was trying to get some of those like user niceties into a Visual Basic web forms app, right? Because they are like the full postback, ASPX like files where it's a clunky user experience. But they're like, well, we want a nicer user experience. And I'm like, okay, I'll do my best, and so, you try to make it so you get your hovers, you get your like, like hiding and showing of elements, and all of that stuff was done in JavaScript using jQuery.
Okay. And this is all done like on the job. So you're employed, you're able to do it on the job.
Yes. And I was very lucky. There are a lot of people that don't get that opportunity.
Right.
It is the best way to learn. If you can get yourself in some sort of position where you have an actual problem that you have to solve, because it's real hard to make yourself a problem that's as hard as the problems you're going to face at work.
It's true. Okay. Look, now I want to go off on that a little bit too, because I do think that there is a bit of a problem with getting new developers into the industry.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think there's enough opportunities to be it like apprenticeships or job shadowing. And I think of about being a doctor.
Yeah.
And if you want to go into med school, even to get accepted to med school, you have had to have done X number of job shadowing hours with
Yes.
doctors in the office while you're watching them. Is that something you think is practical for web development? Is that something you think we should even be looking at doing?
I do. And so I do believe I'm right there with you. There is a problem with finding opportunities. It's from the perspective, so I'm a track lead on my team now. Um, from my perspective, it's a lot of work, right?
Right.
So I have to set aside time to pair with people, to make sure they understand concepts, to sort of make sure I'm feeding them tickets they can succeed at. Like it's a lot of work on my time, out
Yeah.
of my time. But if I do it well, I reap the benefits, right? So
Right.
I mentored, so I work at Cisco, and since Cisco is a larger company, they do a lot of internships. And then they have this other program, it's like a post-graduation program. So if you are graduating from undergrad or like a boot camp, you're eligible to go through this program.
Right.
And essentially it's like they kind of teach you, they spend it's CX Academy. And so they do a little bit of like not a little bit, they do quite a bit of just like professional development where they're like, this is how you give a performance, this is how you give it's like a performance but for business people, presentation, there we go. Like this is how you put together a presentation, these are like, this is how you make good slides, this is the kind of language you need to use while you're speaking to people who are not technical, this like all of these things that we take for granted that we kind of
Right.
have to learn on the job and be like, well, that was a giant cluster, like that didn't work. So they're kind of teaching them those skills, which I think is wonderful. But in the meantime, they're essentially filling the role of like an intern on your team.
Okay.
And so last year, I mentored a couple of students in that program. And this year, one of my students from last year was promoted. He was like promoted to the next grade of software engineer, right? And he's
Awesome.
honestly
Okay.
one of the strongest members of his team, right?
Cool.
And so it's because I took that time, and not just me, like actually someone you might know, Eric Slack, took the time
Hmm.
to really spend time with him, teach him, like these are good patterns. This is how you write a good unit test. This is how you write a good pull request.
Yeah.
This is how, like, I want you to, here's a problem for you, work on it for an hour. If you're stuck, reach out, right? Like, because it's good for people to learn how to struggle. I don't want to have a whole like herd of junior developers that only ask me questions because
Right.
I will get exhausted, right?
Right.
I want them to learn how to self-serve knowledge. And the best way to do that is teaching them, okay, go do it, but don't do the Lara and spend 3 weeks on the same problem, right? Like
Right.
there, I'm here, like I'm still here. Cause that's what I lacked in my early career was anyone who had like anyone I knew personally or well enough to be like, hey, can you help me with this?
Right.
Because at about 6 months into that job, I knew more than the head of IT. And so I was solving problems that he didn't understand even. And
Yeah.
so it became really hard for me to get feedback from people. And that's why I started going to conferences.
Okay.
But yeah, I think it's just so important. But it is a huge time and energy investment. I
Yeah.
was actually talking with Alex. So Alec Akrushko is our lead architect. And I was
Yeah.
talking with him at one point. And so when I started in 2021, Cisco desperately needed strong leadership, good senior software engineers. Like that's what they were missing. They were just missing that tier of knowledge, right?
Yeah.
So we spent a whole year where we really didn't hire a lot of junior developers or even mid-level developers. We were only hiring people that really knew what they were doing. But the benefit of that is that now we're in a position where we're like, okay, now that we're all gelled together, like we're
Right.
working together, we understand our goals, like we know how to communicate with each other. The code base is getting like there's much better examples in the code base. Now we can start to hire in junior developers, mid-career developers, and really help shape and grow them into the developers that we need on our team.
Yeah.
Because that's the beauty of taking in somebody who's early in their career is that this is your chance to make them write code like you want them to, right?
Right.
Instead of like being like, why are you doing that? You can be
Yeah.
like, on a pull request, why are you doing that? No. I mean, like on a pull request, I'm usually like very specific, and I'll even go so far as to be like, hey, this is too big for me to write in a comment. Let's pair for an hour.
Yeah.
Let's get this going. And that time investment does pay off, but it's so hard to make when you're just kind of in the weeds yourself.
We
So
totally need to have a full discussion about this, because this really is like an episode in and of itself, just talking about
yes.
training, not just juniors, but even people who are coming from, like in your case, like back end.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like I totally want to go more into this
Yeah. Yeah.
at a
And even
different,
like teaching, like sometimes even with senior developers, like you get somebody who's been in the industry for a while and they're like, I know what I'm doing. I'm doing it
right?
this way. And you're like, okay, that's really cool that you're doing it that way, but this is how we're doing it.
Yeah.
And this is
Yeah.
why. And so like I very rarely I run into problems where it's like I'm arguing with somebody about some stupid pattern and I'm like, listen, we already talked about this. You
Right.
want to talk about this again? We have a meeting literally on the calendar every week where we can talk about this. Like
Yeah.
we're not going to be like you do it our way or you leave, right? But it's like there's processes in place. And so especially if you're on a large team, it's so important to just like it's like shared expectations, right? That's something that we have shared expectations for excellence. And so
Yeah.
it's so important to define those processes, define your expectations so that when people come in, they're not like, whoa, 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 I didn't know we were doing that. It's like, yeah, we
Right.
look at this
Oh.
document right here. It says that's what we're doing,
Yeah. Yeah.
so
So
yeah,
important. Okay. So
definitely.
then let's get into the Angular part of this,
Yes.
because you did all the C sharp, the .NET. You
Yes.
were successful in that, like you said, within 6 months. You
They
kind of already
didn't
knew
fire
more
me.
than,
I
yeah,
released an application.
yeah.
One of the pieces of my application even had the president of our biggest client write my company and tell them how much they liked the new feature I
No way.
developed. And
Wow.
it was like,
That's awesome.
oh, I mean, the
Yeah.
code was horrendous. It was like a Christmas tree of if statements, but man, it got the job done. So
Yeah. Well, that's impressive. You're basically like on the job learning. You did it fairly quickly.
yes.
Then all of a sudden, like, how did Angular come into the picture? When did
Okay.
that become something you knew you wanted to do?
So back to the JavaScript, like jQuery JavaScript, like that's a clunky business. It's like really hard to like it's a very manual process if you want to get like binding, like two-way binding, right? When I change this, I
Right.
want this to appear here, right? So that can get really hard. And so I was going to conferences, and the conference that my boss would send me to was in St. Louis,
Okay.
and it was at that time it was Days of .NET. Now in St. Louis in 2016. Angular was big, and I think it's still relatively big in St. Louis, but there were a
Okay.
ton of Angular developers. And Angular 2 I believe, had just come out. So it was like there were a lot of conference talks, and there was a couple specifically. The one that like really hooked me was where somebody like made this like app really fast, and then they did two-way binding, and I was like,
Mm. Ooh.
oh, that's magic. I want to do that. Like,
Nice.
yes, please. And so that was what sort of got it on my radar. I'm like, okay,
Okay.
there are better solutions than the Ajax toolkit. So like anyone who's listening or like watching that's ever used the Ajax toolkit, that thing is a joke. It's horrible. And it's like pretending to give you like responsive like elements and stuff, but really it's just still doing the same old garbage. It's just doing it in like a smaller part of your application. And
Okay.
so it was just like it seemed to be this thing that would solve all the problems. And so
Yeah.
I was interested in it. I also knew I didn't want to be writing like I wouldn't be one of those developers that's like, I'm a COBOL developer. That's just what I do. I'm going to do that until the day I die. Like
Right. Okay.
I was interested in like I'm a scientist. I'm an artist. I'm creative. I like to try new things. I like to see how new things work. I love taking things apart. Right. So it was this problem I could chew on and try to solve.
Okay.
And so that's what got me interested in it. So pretty much anytime I would go to conferences, I was watching a lot of videos on YouTube, just trying to figure out how this thing worked.
Okay. I have
So
to give a plug there too, because like the importance of conferences, and like what
yes.
you're saying, even if you don't fully understand what the talk is about, I think so much
Mhm.
of it is just becoming aware of what else is out there,
Yes.
and kind of, putting that at least in your periphery, like just being aware of things and knowing what else is available, I think is really, really important.
It
And
is.
so then you know your options, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so the first conference I went to, I'd only been writing software for like 6 months. I really didn't understand 90% of what anybody said. Like
Yeah.
I was getting the off by one jokes, like there were certain jokes. I'm like, oh, I get that. Like I finally get that. But
Yeah.
like I didn't know, like somebody said source control. I didn't know what that meant. And I was too
Mm.
embarrassed to ask, so like I basically bring one of my little notebooks and my strategy was to sit in those talks and write down. I wrote down any word I didn't understand so
Okay.
that I could Google it later. I also followed all the speakers
Mhm.
on social media.
Okay.
And that was actually a really important part of my strategy was just any conference, I'd follow the conference, I'd follow any of the frameworks like Angular, React, .NET, like anything I could follow on social media, any person, any framework, any language, anything I could follow, I followed. Because
Okay.
what I started to realize is that these like the speakers a lot of times they would like message out their slide decks. So
Right.
even if I couldn't make it to the conference, I could still see the slide deck. Or they might message out a link to a YouTube video or like they were providing me content that was specific to what I wanted. So it was like
Right.
it was filtering it to me so I no longer had to like do that deep dive page scrolling through pages of
Yeah.
results to figure out what to read, right?
Yeah.
And so that was really important. And then it also gave me the opportunity to talk to people. I remember talking to, I can't remember who it was I talked to. It was somebody from Microsoft. He was an older gentleman and he was very nice to me. Um, and it's like I told him I was writing Visual Basic. He's like, no, I told him I was writing web forms. He was like, oh
Okay.
yeah, that's rough. And then I was like, in Visual Basic. And he's like,
Ooh.
ooh. And I was like,
Nice.
okay, so it's just nice to hear that like my suspicions that what I was doing was kind of like not maybe what I wanted to be doing. I was like,
Yeah.
okay, like cool. But yeah, it just meeting people, kind of sharing experiences with people. Like I would make it a point to try to go sit with other women at
Okay.
tables because they're as a woman in tech, I'm sure it's no secret to you. There's not a ton of us. I feel
Right.
like there's more than when I started. But this is a heavily male field.
Yeah. Especially
And
with retention, I feel like.
yeah,
Right.
exactly. And honestly, I spoke to one of my interns, this she was one of our interns, Hovita. She's a wonderful woman. And I believe she said she was at UC Santa Cruz and she had somebody in her department. There was a gatekeeper who's just like some douchey bro that made her feel like she didn't belong there.
Yeah.
And she was like on the verge of dropping out. Now, this is a woman who is like, she's the first in her family to go to college. She's like a first, her parents were immigrants. Like, this is a big deal, not only just to her, but to her family. And here we have some douchey guy that's like, you don't belong because
Right.
you aren't a man like me, and it's like, dude, what? But
Yeah.
luckily she is a determined, brilliant woman who's like, yeah, screw that. I'm just gonna keep going. And she got this internship at Cisco. And then
Wow.
she was like, wait a minute. Oh, those douchey bros really aren't tolerated
That's
here.
not the reality of what the job's
Yeah.
gonna be. But well, and I think
Yeah.
you're hitting on some really important things here because you're not the first person I've heard say you were networking, you were
Yeah.
talking to people, following people. And I
Mhm.
think that's really an interesting thing because a lot of us talk about as a developer, I'm so introverted. I'm an introvert. I don't
Yeah.
like talking to people. And yet it's really, I think, an important and literally like critical aspect of
Yes.
being a developer. You have to learn how to ask questions, how to be okay talking to people,
Yes. Yes.
comfortable being uncomfortable in these conversations that are overwhelming.
Yes. Oh
So,
gosh, and they're so overwhelming because like I'm always afraid that somebody's gonna ask me something and
right?
I'm gonna be like, I don't know.
I don't know.
Now you're gonna know I'm an idiot.
Yes.
Like there's just always that like creeping. And I think there's so many of us that feel that way. That's just like, what if I'm an idiot?
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
like, I'm getting to the point where I'm like, I don't think I'm an idiot because I actually have solved a lot of problems and like I do write good code. But it's like even just the way people phrase questions sometimes can be confusing.
Yes.
It's like they might use a word I don't, especially not coming from a computer science background.
Yeah. Yes.
Throw out some crazy like CS term. I might not understand what you're talking about.
Exactly.
I might fully understand the concept. I just might not have the words to relate
Express
to what
it.
you're saying to me. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah. And so, and there's just also, there's a matter of like focus, right? There's certain things that I like that I focus on that I care about, right? Like I
Right.
can talk to you about change detection in Angular. I can talk to you about, like unit testing. Like there's certain things that I'm like, I really like and I spend a lot of my energy talking about, right? Or focusing on. And then there's other people that focus on completely different parts of it.
Yeah,
Like I have never built my own computer. I probably won't ever do that.
right.
I will never be a sysadmin. I have no idea. When you start talking to me about firewalls, I know what they do, but I don't know how to set one up. I don't like, there's a lot of that stuff that's just like, I don't come from that direction. So I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah,
But you don't have to know everything to be good at what you do. Like it's okay to be a specialist, like to be the one that's like, that's not how NGRX works, right? Like,
yeah,
uh, I might not be able to tell you how to configure your AWS pipeline, whatever, right? But like, I can tell you how to do this or whatever,
yeah.
like there's parts of it that there's specific parts of software engineering that people focus in on, and it's almost impossible to be a excellent generalist about everything.
Everything. So what do you
So,
do then? Like when you come across something, be it for work or whatever, where it's not your specialty, maybe it's not even something you're particularly interested in, but you have to learn it anyway. And
mhm,
and like kind of relate this to when you were first learning Angular,
yes.
when you came across things that were really difficult, or now, what do you do to actually learn those things?
So if I turn on caveman mode, right? And I was like, mash, mash, mash. And
Nice.
I do that. Well, actually, I usually start to Google. So one example I could give is I was new on a team at a I was consulting. I was new on this team and I was on a really big team. So everyone would grab up all the easy tickets and they'd always leave the configuration tickets.
Okay.
And I'm like, somebody's got to do these configuration
Yep.
tickets. And I have no idea how to write a Helm chart. Like, I don't know, but I'm going to pick it up. I'm going to see what happens.
Nice.
And so first you try to understand what the ticket wants. And then, I try to look for examples of it. Like if I'm working in a company, like if it's something at Cisco and it's something I don't know how to do, I'll be like, are there other examples of it in the code base anywhere?
Right.
Are they good examples in the code base? Because that's
Yeah.
another thing that like some of it is deciding, is this a good pattern or a bad pattern?
Yeah.
And then if I can't find that, then I start to Google and I'll try to find has somebody written a blog? Has somebody done a video? When I did my talk at ng-conf, I did it on custom generators. We write generators at Cisco, but we were writing them the older way, right? Not
Okay.
the local plugin way. And when I did my talk, local plugins are the way that we should be writing those now. So I needed to like fill that gap. So I just started Googling, I started reading what I could, and then I start tinkering.
Okay.
So I'm not afraid to cut a branch and just like make it a disaster, right?
Yeah.
Like if
Okay.
I need to, yeah, like I will delete code. I will, it's like as long as you're doing it on your branch, it doesn't matter what you
Doesn't
do.
matter.
You can
Yeah.
trash the place, right?
Yeah.
And so um that's what I do.
Okay.
And then I tried another way. So it's just like a lot of experimentation and just kind of knowing when to reach out for resources. Um, and not letting myself just like burn out,
Yeah.
spinning my wheels because
Yeah.
I'm afraid to reach out. And if I get super stuck, I start reaching out to people, to
Okay.
teammates, or reaching out on Twitter, or reaching out, like I reached out to Zach DeRose when I
Okay.
was writing that talk because I wanted his take on what the difference was between the two. Like
Yeah.
I had my idea of what it was, but I wanted to hear somebody who was like on the ground really deeply in this stuff sort of confirm what I already thought I knew.
Well, and that's what I love about the Angular community too, is that people are so willing.
They
I
are.
think when you get into it at first, you're like, yeah, right, that person would answer me. But come to find out, actually, most people are very willing to work with you and
Yeah.
meet with you. And I
Especially if you
loved it.
don't come at them like don't come at somebody like a rabid dog, right? Like if you come at them like a human being, like we'll meet your humanity with humanity, right? Like it's
Yeah.
um but yeah, and that's one thing I learned also with the Angular community, because I remember I was really interested in it. I did get to go to ng-conf 2017. That was like something I don't know how I pulled that off with my old boss. I do know how I pulled it off. They did not give me a very good raise. Like they gave me a very, very disappointing raise. And I was
Okay.
like, okay, I'm pretty disappointed. You can make it up to me if you send me to this
Give me
conference.
this. Nice.
And so they did. And that was
Okay.
great. I was so glad to go. And that's when I was like, yes, this is what I want. Like I really this is interesting. This seems innovative. This seems like like there's so many possibilities within what is happening here. And it was really honestly the first time I felt like I belonged in a community.
Nice.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, this is my community. I love this community. How can I stay involved in it after the conference? Right. Because I think that's something we all struggle with. It's like we get
Yep.
there, we're like, yes, we're doing it. We're being social nerds. Like we're hanging out. We're all wearing the same sweatshirts and t-shirts.
Yeah.
We're karaokeing. We're like doing all the things. And then the conference ends.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, want back to my cave.
Well, I'm going to give a shameless plug then to the meetup, to the Angular community meetup,
Exactly.
because that's the whole point of what we're doing now is making it so that it's ng-conf 12 months of the year.
Yeah.
So when the conference is over, you still have a community to lean on, come hang out with us. I think it's super important. I know
Yes.
for me, just like you were saying with your friend, that she had this jerk boss who was, being that gatekeeper for her. And I would love to say that wasn't my case, but I've come across some people like
Yeah.
that as well. And had I not had the meetup or been part of ng-conf, I would never have kept going in this.
Oh yeah.
It gives you such a support system that is
It does.
like unparalleled.
It does. And you see
Yeah.
people like actually speaking out against that, right? Like
Right.
I've definitely seen people in the community shutting it down. It does not mean it doesn't exist, but I've definitely seen people be like, nope. And then behind the scenes too, people be like, yeah, that person we cannot
Right.
put that person on stage. They are not a nice person.
Yeah.
And
Totally.
so I think it's important for that. But yeah, I think what I found after going to that conference, that's when I was really starting to follow people. I was following Aaron Frost. I was following like Tracy Lee, like all these people I had seen that I really admired, that I was like, they seem like really great people. I was too shy to introduce myself when I was at the conference because that's the person I am. Like I am like I'm a very I'm a very extroverted introvert.
Yeah.
But only to a point. And so I was so nervous, but I followed them. And so I kind of like just like sort of silently stalked them for a while. But then I'd start to answer things or, like respond or, like you start to like sort of play along and like you can kind of like do a thing here or even just retweeting people, right? Like, people note, like I get notifications if you retweet me, right? So I see that you did that. And then I'm like, who are you? And I'll go look and I'll see what else you've said, so it's like, I can actually meet people that way. And I see that happen even now. Like there were several people at ng-conf who took the time to introduce themselves to me and everybody else.
Yep.
And then I'm following them. Other speakers are following them. And now they're actually speaking. Adi Golm is actually doing TinyConf, which is another way to stay involved in the Angular community. And he's speaking. It's Marcus, right? Like great guy, right? And it's like, but it was because Marcus put himself out there.
Yep.
And like was like, hi, I'm Marcus. And I love what you do. And I would love to do it too.
Well, and just to give everybody some context, like Marcus is a younger developer who's from Sweden, and he came in, he brought treats specifically from Sweden and was like giving them out to people who he had met somehow or some way. But he literally, like, we would kind of say, hey, do you want to come meet so-and-so? And he'd be like, oh, I already did.
I know. He was like, he was impressive. He was doing all the things that my little heart wanted to do.
Yes.
But I was too anxious and weird to do it. And he's just like, I'm going for it.
Just goes for it. It's so smart. So smart. But okay.
So smart. Anyway.
You want to focus a little bit on this conference idea too, because so like we've talked about how you moved from backend, you got into Angular. What I'm finding fascinating is your learning resources. You've got the YouTube down, you were really networking, making the most of social media. You mentioned some books and just not like kind of being fearless, just trying
Yeah.
things out and experimenting, but also really making sure to communicate with people, stay in those
Yes.
conversations.
Yes.
One thing that I think you do that a lot of people would go, that's not for me, no thank you, is that you, and this is why I'm bringing it back into conferences, is because you do speak at
Yes.
conferences. So what I'd love to know, and let's kind of like make this one of our wrapping up questions here, is how has that benefited your learning? How does giving talks help you learn things? And then for those people who are just like, talking is not for me, I'm not interested in that, how can they use, how can they still do something that would help them in the same way?
Yes. So, first of all, I got into speaking because I love going to conferences. And sometimes when you're working, like sometimes your company won't send you.
Right.
So, but it turns out a lot of conferences will sponsor you to come speak. And I'm like, I can do anything for 30 minutes. And
Nice.
so that was how I initially got over it, right? Because I was really scared,
Yeah.
very nervous. I had no idea what I was doing. Like, I thought that I had to write some I thought I had to have the whole like talk done before I could submit it. That
Right.
is not true. You just
Right.
have to have a clear idea of what your talk is going to be.
Right.
So that's one thing I can dispel for people right away is like, you don't have to have your whole talk. You don't have to have it recorded in your basement or something. Like it's literally, you write a really concise description. Usually there's an opportunity to explain why you think you'd be the best one to give this talk. Right. And honestly, one of the most important parts is your title.
Title.
Yeah. You got to have a good title. Cause if you have a dumb title, like if I'm Lara and I'm looking through the conference thing and I'm like, what session am I going to go to? Sometimes all I see is the title. So that title's got to catch my eye.
Yep.
It's got to like concisely say what you're going to talk about. And if it's funny, I give you bonus points.
Exactly. Yeah.
So,
Witty, clever, anything. Agreed.
right, right.
And not cliche.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. But what I get out of conference speaking, because it's a lot of work. It's not nothing, right?
Right.
Because the last thing I want to do is stand up on stage and sound like a moron. Like I don't want to get up there. I don't want to get up there and give incorrect information.
Right.
I don't want to get up there and just like, well, freeze. That would suck. But I do have a backup plan. If that ever happens to you, you just start like dancing.
Oh, okay. There you
Yeah,
go.
or like chanting, or you just freeze and then you slowly back off the stage and everyone will be so confused about what's happening, no one will notice.
You can just get those two rocks and start banging them together,
Exactly.
right?
Look at me, I'm software engineering. And
Nice.
so, but what I get out of writing conference talks is it gives me the opportunity to not only dig deeper into the topic, but to try to figure out new ways to explain it.
Hmm.
Because that's what makes a conference talk great is if
Yeah.
you have a very relatable way to explain what you're talking about.
Yes.
There are brilliant people in our community who can get up and talk for hours and hours and hours on a topic. 90% of what they say will go right over my head because
Yep.
they are so deeply engrossed in their work that it's just not relatable to me.
Right.
Like I need the analogies, I need visual examples, I need like sort of like clarified code examples.
Yep.
So like one of the tools I rely on heavily is StackBlitz.
Okay.
Because when I originally started writing conference talks, I thought, oh gosh, I'm going to have to write a whole bunch of applications to talk about what I'm talking about. And then I realized, no, I really just need the code snippet.
Yeah.
So I can go spin that up in StackBlitz. I can show how that works. So when I did my talk it was Switch Map Wizard, talking about the varying mapping operators for ArcsJS, I was able to spin up some very clear examples in StackBlitz, and then you can save it and share those examples out to people.
Right.
So you could really see the difference between the 4 different operators, right? And so that's what conference talks do for me is it allows me to sort of clarify my thinking on a topic, to really dig in deep to it, and to think about different ways to explain it.
Yeah.
When I sit down to write a conference talk, it usually goes, I mean, I usually get up to like 300 slides for a 25-minute talk.
Wow.
I don't have that many, but
Right.
it's because I'm cutting. Like I'll think, oh, I'll talk about it this way. Like I wanted to talk about reactivity in Angular, using a car wash analogy, and I had it like kind of working, but it wasn't working. And so I had to
Yeah.
cut it. Right. You know,
Okay.
so it's like you also have to be like not precious about what you're doing.
Yeah.
Like sometimes your ideas suck and you just have to be like, okay, that idea kind of sucked. It doesn't work.
Throw it out.
Throw it out. It's okay. Or like I have like a whole like garbage bin slide deck where I have sort of like the half-baked ideas,
Okay.
you know, so like I can go back to them later if I really think I can get it to work.
Yeah.
But yeah,
That's
so
a
that's
smart idea.
important. Yeah. But then there's the whole like, now I got to stand on stage and talk about it.
Yeah.
Now, I was a cheerleader in high school, and that was one of the most embarrassing things I've ever done. Right. So it's like you're standing in front of the crowd. You're like, especially like dance squad, because a lot of times like they couldn't hear the music. They just see you out there like dancing. And it just like, for me, it was deeply embarrassing because I'm like, I don't like to have that amount of attention, but I survived that. Right. So I'm like, okay, if I survived that, I can stand on stage in front of a bunch of people and do this.
Nice.
Because everyone in the audience wants you to do well. Nobody is,
Right.
there might be some jerk face out in the audience who's like, I want to see this person fall on their face, right? Like, I hate Lara Newsom for some reason. That's fine, right? But what I care about are the people that are out there and, you know, like you can see their eyes and they're like, they're looking up at you and they're like, give me something good, Lara. Like, let's do this thing, right? So if I can connect even with one person in the audience, I feel like, okay, I've done it. I did it. I did great.
Yeah.
Now, again, it's just really hard to do that. Like one of the things I didn't realize when I started talking is that my brain and my mouth are not always connected.
Exactly.
And so like I can go through my slides, they'll make perfect sense in my brain as I'm like flipping through them. But if I don't do it out loud, I don't know if it's going to work.
Okay.
And so like the biggest mistake you could make as a speaker is to always be like thinking what you're going to say on your slides. And then on the day you give your presentation, stand up and try to actually say it out loud.
Right.
Like, you have to practice. Like
Practice
you
out loud.
really have to practice out loud.
Yeah.
Because especially if you're introverted brain thinker, the language is different from here to here. And so yeah, that's like my biggest advice. And then there are some people who will never, ever do that.
Right.
And that is totally cool, because another thing we need in this community are articles, or even just somebody who can make code examples and be like, hey, check this out. I did this.
Yeah.
You know, or like, you know, like even somebody that can digest what's coming out in a new version, or, you know, like that kind of work is valuable as well. And you can get the same level of depth and knowledge writing an article that you can doing a conference talk.
Okay. So pick what you feel more comfortable with.
Yes. And frankly, you can even mentor people. Like that's enough to contribute to the community.
True.
It might not be, it's not the showiest. Like it's not the one where people are like, I'm going to fly you to Romania to mentor people.
Yeah.
But it is a way to like to give back to the community and actually really help a person, right? Because that's why we do it, really, is to help people in the end.
Well, and what it does too is it makes it, if you're explaining something to someone who doesn't understand it yet, you have to, like you said, come up with those analogies, come up with the simplified explanation that helps you to clarify it in your own mind, right?
Yes,
like,
definitely.
If you can explain it to someone else with less understanding than you, then I think your ability to articulate it really helps you to understand it.
Yeah.
And I totally agree with what you said about analogies. It's something I actually have been thinking a lot about lately. And for me, it was hugely critical with when I had my mentor. It was actually Eric Slack. You mentioned him. And that is one thing that the guy just excels at. I mean, he's
a wonderful teacher.
Oh, yeah.
And he is like, he does not like, okay, so I work with Eric.
Yeah.
And the level of time and love and effort that he puts into helping people.
Yes.
I think it's hard to understate. Yeah. And I just like, I see it and I know it. And I know you see it and you know it. And a lot of it, but it's like we said, it's just one of those things where it's not like, I feel like we need like the trophies, like we need the like award ceremony for the super, like the on the grounds, really blood and gutsing it.
Yeah.
People who are really making
mentors.
A good difference. Yeah. The mentors. So, but yeah, so I would say if you're looking to broaden your knowledge to share with the community, there's really like, there's public speaking, which is like the showboating, like that's like, you got to be willing to stand on stage and be a little sweaty in front of people.
Yeah.
There's article writing that can be really hard for people. I know for me, I don't, English was not a thing I was super good at. I mean, like I speak English, it's my native language, but I mean like writing it, right? Like,
Writing, yeah.
and making it cohesive and clear and not rambly. And I, like I
Engaging.
got that like high school English teacher, like, that's not good enough, like she was such a witch, but
Yeah.
I just got her in my head, and it's taken me a long time to kick her out, right? And so that can be very that can make people feel very exposed. But the cool
Right.
thing about an article is you can share that one-on-one with people pretty easily and be like, hey, can you read this and tell me what you think?
True.
Um,
Yeah.
That's
Have a network of people that can help you review it, edit it.
exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's mentoring, and that's pretty, like, as far as like public embarrassment goes, that's pretty low stakes, right? But
Yeah.
it's probably the most impactful.
True.
So
Yeah.
another mentor we have in our community is Lucas, right? Lucas
Yeah.
Rubicki. Like he is, I personally know he's an amazing mentor because I work with a lot of his mentees
Nice. Okay.
because he's such a solid guy. But I don't know if people really understand what he's doing, right? Like
Right.
that he's actually like kind of launching people. He's taking people, and he's taking people. One of his mentees I met at ng-conf has been working at Starbucks, right? Like,
Mhm.
like he's a guy, he's a smart guy, and he wants to do software engineering. And Lucas is like, come with me, man, I'll help you.
Yeah.
You
Come
know?
sit in my office
Mm.
with me. I will train
Yeah.
you on the side. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like
Mm.
that is such a generous and important thing for people in the community, and it goes often unrecognized.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, that's another way that you can. And honestly, you have to learn a lot because your mentees will ask you questions that you never thought about. They'll be like, "Why are you doing that?" And you'll be like, "I don't know. I just always done it this way.
Yeah.
Let's find out." And that's that is another thing I do if I'm mentoring somebody or even pairing with somebody, and they say, "Why is it like that?" And I say, "I don't know. Let's find out
Let's
together."
find out. Yeah.
Google with them, right? Like you don't have to be the like, I'm dad and I know how everything works. It's like you can be a vulnerable learner as well.
Yeah. I
So
love it. I love that. All right. So let's answer one more question before we
okay.
wrap up here. And it's just like, I guess it's kind of twofold here, but like what's kind of the last advice that you would give anybody watching? But what I really am curious about too is like in addition to that advice, is there something that you felt like you ever did in your learning journey, your learning path that wasn't helpful and that you feel like that wasn't worth my time? Please nobody else do that. Like was there ever anything like that?
Um so it's like this is like one of those like tell me what you don't do best about yourself, but it's the imposter syndrome, right? Like
Okay.
it's the beating myself up,
Yeah.
right? Like that um because it's so hard. We want people to think we're smart. We want people to think we know what we're doing. We want people to respect us professionally.
Right.
And sometimes you just have to make yourself vulnerable and find out, right? And part of it is like it's not just it's not just putting yourself out there, but it's also learning how to receive feedback.
Yeah.
Um because like nothing makes me more nervous than giving a talk and having somebody I really respect say, I have some feedback for you. Cause I'm like, oh God, what's it gonna be?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's like you just kind of gotta like stomach that and be like, give me that feedback. And then you take it and you grow with it, right? Like, so I'd say beating myself up and like taking it too personally, right? Like it's code. It doesn't, I mean, it matters, right? Like it's my job, whatever. But it really doesn't matter. If I did something in an inefficient way, tell me, right? Like I think the biggest mistake you can make especially at any point in your career, honestly, is taking it personally. When I mean, sometimes people give feedback in a way that feels very personal, and I would say
Right.
that those people are not good at giving feedback.
Right.
But when somebody is giving you honest feedback and you take it deeply personal and you're like, I suck, I'm a piece of crap. It's like that is a cycle of shame and blame that you're never going to get out of, right? You need to just look at the feedback, say, okay, I've heard your feedback. Do I understand it? Okay. If you don't understand it, ask for clarity, right? Once you get your clarity, if you understand it, then what do you do about it? that's you taking ownership and responsibility of that feedback, right? So you say, you've given me this feedback. I understand what you're saying. I might not agree with you. And that's okay. That's one way you can go. You could say, well,
Right.
I don't agree with you, and here's why. But then you have to be willing to listen to what they say back, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes you can change people's minds, or you incorporate it into how you write software, right? So there's like, it just really doesn't help. There's just that sort of like churning, burning cycle of shame and blame and guilt and anxiety that just it'll keep you underwater.
Yeah.
And you just have to look for ways to just realize that that's there for everybody. It's like a riptide. Anyone that goes in the ocean might get stuck in a riptide, but you have to know what to do if you do. Like, you have to know, like, no, you actually swim out. It doesn't make sense. Like,
Yeah.
go into that shame, go into that feedback, and then you can come out a stronger person, right?
Well,
So,
and do everything that, oh, I love it. I love how it's coming full circle here, because the way to get out of the riptide is all the things that you've been talking about this whole time.
mhm.
Reach out to other people, follow people on Twitter, go to conferences, go to the Angular community meetup.
Yep. Do the
Uh,
scary things. Like, do the
yeah,
things that freak you out. Like, it's
yeah,
okay to be like anxious and scared sometimes. Like,
yeah.
it's okay. Like, you'll like, it's temporary, and eventually then you get to go back to the beach and lay and be like, "Oh my gosh. I can't believe I just did that."
Nice.
So, yeah.
Cool. Okay. Well, thank you so much. This
Yeah.
is such good advice. I think, and these are all doable things. That's what I love about it. There's nothing, so many people feel overwhelmed when it comes to learning how to code. And
Yes.
again, like going back to what we said at the beginning, oh, Angular, that's so hard. Why would you ever learn that? Well,
Yeah.
it's doable. And
Yeah.
Lara just laid all of it out so simply. And it all really is things that every one of us can do. You just take it
Yeah.
one step at a time. So,
Yeah, exactly. Just figure out one thing you can do today that will improve how you feel, right?
yeah.
And yeah, and then you just go with it. So yeah, it's all doable, uh, and attainable, and yeah, you just have to be willing to be a little bit uncomfortable sometimes.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And if anybody wants to connect with Lara, she really is very entertaining and fun to follow on Twitter.
Yes.
And her handle, which is so awesome, is Lara Nerdsome.
Yes.
And her name is Lara. So no
Yes.
you, but
No you.
Lara Nerdsome.
Yep.
And
With
yeah.
no E on the end. I'm against extra vowels. And then I
Listen,
actually have joined Mastodon as well, so you can find
okay.
me over there, because who knows what's going to happen with Twitter.
Right. I was hearing this morning that Elon is declaring bankruptcy. So,
Like, okay,
right.
we'll just see what happens.
Uh,
But yeah, I'm Lara Newsom on Mastodon. And then if you're more comfortable reaching out to me on something like LinkedIn, I'm also on LinkedIn. I look like this. My picture. This, if you see a person that looks like this, it's probably me. So, because it's my name and a bunch of numbers afterwards. So